Yeah, so first and foremost, Mark, Lincoln Riley, if you've ever listened to any of his press conferences, he doesn't divulge a whole lot of information, and he's very even keel. I think this was the most animated that I've seen him in any kind of a press conference setting since he's been at Oklahoma, and I think a lot of that animation was really kind of directed towards the Trey Bradford situation. So there was a question that was asked of him, and he said, hey, I'm not pulling any punches. I'm not trying to tell you guys anything, not tell you guys anything that I know that I'm holding back. And basically, he just said, I don't know. I don't know what happened. I don't know. We had no indication that he was unhappy. No indication that he was, even considering entering the transfer portal wherever he ends up going back to LSU. So I think they were really taken by surprise and a little bit upset, I think, in the whole situation. And he talked about the successful transfers that Oklahoma has had, and this was one that in his words that they obviously swung and missed on. So I think that kind of delved into some other questions in terms of just what the running back room looks like, and it's hard to tell Mark if he feels like this, if this is coach speak, or if this is really kind of the way he feels. But he did make the comment that he felt like the running back room of any room had the ability to absorb something like this close to the season, more than maybe some other areas on the team. So I think he talked about Jaden Knowles and Todd Hudson, the two walk-ons, being the primary number 3 and number 4 guys coming into at least at the first part of the season, and then really talked about if Oklahoma gets to a point where some of that depth is challenged through injuries or suspensions or whatever happens. Whatever happens through the course of the year, then, they may look at other areas within the team. You'd mentioned Brian Darby as a guy who's a wide receiver now, but did play running back in high school. So he actually mentioned there's a couple of other wide receivers that are certainly in that same situation. So he felt, so I think he's fairly confident with Jaden Knowles. I think was the first name that came out of his mouth in terms of who will probably see the field from a third team running back perspective. So I think that was interesting, kind of hearing him talk about that. He talked a little bit about the offensive line. We had talked about this with this, and then some of the individual stuff that I did that I had heard that Tyrese Robinson, who had started many games at guard, had moved over to right tackle. So I think the guards and the right tackle are pretty much solidified, with Marquise Hayes being your left guard, Chris Murray being the right guard, and then Tyrese Robinson getting the start over at right tackle. Talked a little bit about there's still some position battles going on at the center, which was a little bit shocking for me to hear, just in terms of that it's not quite in his mind solidified. In terms of the center and the left tackle position, specifically the center position. He talked about Andrew Raymond and Robert Conjal as the two guys that are working there. I have heard over the last week that Conjal has consistently made a big jump. Don't know how much of it is, he's challenging Raym for that starting center position, or more so it's just really kind of a depth situation that they're looking at. The left tackle, Anton Harrison and Wanye Morris, are battling there. So I think 3 of the top 5, and I think they'll make the decision on that Friday. I think just the other thing that was a little bit, and this kind of moving to the defensive side of the ball, when Alex Grinch talked a little bit to the media, he kind of spoke about the depth on the defensive line. And this isn't to concern Oklahoma fans watching this, but Perion Winfrey had been dinged up just a little bit. Nothing serious or anything that's going to keep him out, but it allowed some opportunity for some of those other kids among the defensive line interior, and I think from what I had heard, they really took advantage of that. So I think he feels strongly, about going 8 deep, from a defensive tackle interior perspective. So I think that's comforting to hear that that might be a position where they could. They could take some hits if they needed to. And then another kid that really talked a little bit about Justin Broyles, who's a guy, he's a senior here this year, for Oklahoma. He's been, highly recruited kid out of the state of Oklahoma. Hasn't always just put it together. And really, he'd been forced into action a little bit previously. I think he played, certainly played a lot in the LSU game a couple of years ago when he was forced into duty with Delarian Turner Yell out. Didn't really perform well, got exposed to a certain degree, but Grinch kind of talked about how great of a jump that he made in the spring, and that's really carried over to the fall. Grinch isn't really the type of guy that blows a lot of smoke. He's really very, he'll tell you straight up what who's playing well, who's not. So definitely wouldn't be surprised to see him in the rotation, and not really a guy that I thought probably would coming in make the two deep. So some interesting roster things kind of talking about. They talked about Caleb Kelly. Feel like that they could use him a little bit more at the rush linebacker edge position as opposed to kind of the Will and the Mike that he's played before. So I think that's interesting to see. And I know there's a lot of comments about the running backs here. One interesting. It doesn't really mean anything on the field, but it's kind of interesting to see the two walk-ons. Jaden Knowles is majoring in meteorology, so he's kind of a weatherman. Todd Hudson is a pilot, so I think that's just kind of, certainly bars no meaning whatsoever to their play on the field, but I thought it was just kind of interesting to mention that both of those kids are, from a field of study perspective, what they're interested in.
OU and Tulane, Jason, with a long and illustrious history and rivalry. Played one time, 2017. Yep. I got the box score in front of me. Sooner fans, would you take another 56-14 win? I would hope so. So 56-14, the game in 2017. As I look at the passing stats from one Baker Mayfield, relieved by a guy named Kyler Murray, I got to wonder if that particular Oklahoma team with Mayfield and Murray is the only time ever, I got to think, that there were two Heisman Trophy winning quarterbacks and two number one draft picks, overall selections on the same team relieving each other.
That's an outstanding trivia question. Yeah.
I can't imagine what other scenario would have had Heisman Trophy winning quarterbacks playing on the same team, and then they are also the number one overall pick. I just can't imagine. I can't think of any such scenario, either scenario, let alone both of them at the same time.
Right. No, that's very interesting. No, I wouldn't think that we would be able to find that anywhere either. Very interesting. And yeah, as you mentioned, 2017. So I think that there's a little bit of intricacy that Tulane brings to the table. They have a little bit more of a kind of a spread option attack that Oklahoma struggled with early on in that game. So I think it'll be interesting to see with. I think that they've moved. They still run that spread option to a certain extent, but they're a little bit more prototypical in the way they attack you. Michael Pratt was a true freshman who played a majority of the season last year for Tulane. Completed about 55% of his passes, 20 touchdowns, 8 interceptions. So he's much more serviceable back there throwing the ball than some of the guys that they've had in the past. But yeah, in that game, Tulane ran up and down the field the first two possessions. Then certainly Oklahoma adjusted and then played much better defensively. But I think you would take a 56-14 game. Specifically, Oklahoma's giving 31. But I think specifically from a defensive perspective, anything under 17, I think that it would be a great success for that first game. But they've got a lot of weapons. I think there's discussion kind of in the preseason and in the offseason was talking about, okay, this Tulane game could be more difficult for Oklahoma than Nebraska, and you scoff at that in the early season. I was like, even though Nebraska is a little bit down, but the dishevelment within that program right now it's hard to ignore. And those of us that watched that game Saturday showed because early in the game they were talking about how Scott Frost felt like this was their best team, and it just looked like more of the same, maybe even worse. So I think it's not a foregone conclusion that this Tulane team could present some bigger challenges to Oklahoma, specifically on the offensive side of the ball.
Brett Bielema is a good coach, and he will upgrade that program, I would expect. But Illinois is arguably the worst team in the Big Ten.
Sure.
And maybe Nebraska's arguably the worst team in the Big Ten. I don't know. We'll have to wait and see. When you look at their schedule, my goodness, this was about the lightest touch they had on the Big Ten schedule. So the numbers are stacked up against them and trying to salvage this season and get to a bowl game. And I'm usually not the alarmist that comes out with those kind of statements before Labor Day. But again, it's Nebraska is a full touchdown favorite against Illinois, losing to a team that was last in the Big Ten in defense and scoring and just across the board, pretty much the worst or second worst team in the Big Ten. And they just lost. Back to this 2017 game real quick, because I always am amused by these things and just looking back to see what was going on then. Baker Mayfield had the type day that you would have expected, 331 in the air, 4 touchdowns, no picks. Kyler Murray came in and threw a touchdown, 3 for 3 for 103. Abdul Adams, who then went to Syracuse, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Yep. 8 carries, 93 yards. Marcellus Sutton had 6 for 63. So they didn't, they ran it 32 through at 30. And to your point about the Tulane attack, how many teams lose by 6 touchdowns and throw 12 passes? You're down by that many scores and you're throwing 12 passes, but they did run for 237. And so that was Tulane and Oklahoma back in 2017.